So, hello and welcome for another episode of the Bitstocks podcast. And really excited about today's episode because there's some crazy stuff going on in the cryptocurrency community right now, predominantly in the Bitcoin world, between the people who deem themselves to be experts and proponents as to what Bitcoin is, and therefore have the authority to define what they think Bitcoin is or isn't, and how to navigate this space and provide information to this space and misinformation to this space. And then you have the other side, which is ultimately the Bitcoin SV camp, the Satoshi's Vision camp, very much spearheaded by Dr. Craig Wright himself, as well as some other big figureheads that have been involved in this space pretty much since Genesis to present. There's been a lot of legal discussion happening in the Bitcoin world. So today I thought, what better time than any other to bring what I would deem to be the best Bitcoin, crypto, blockchain, however you wish to categorize it, lawyer in the country. And I would actually even argue Europe. I'm not going to let your head get too big, right? But everyone that I've engaged with globally around the world over a span of 3-4 years, this man sitting in front of me right now has been on the cutting edge of that and has been one of the people who have taken the approach of just common sense and the approach of you don't need to have an instant answer. What you need to have is the intent to do the research to come back with a clear enough answer from this grey space. So that, without further ado, is George Morris, who is a partner at Simmons Simmons, has been a partner now for 1 year. And once you get to know his story a bit more, you understand why George was made a partner. But I'm not going to do your intro for you. How are you, George?
Very well, thanks, Mike. Thanks for having me. Very kind introduction.
No, you're absolutely welcome. So bring the audience up to speed, I guess, as to your journey, then I guess how we met each other and basically why we're here right now.
Yeah, so I've been a lawyer my entire career. I've had 2 jobs my entire life. Very first one when I was 16, I was a postman. As a summer job,
not know this.
as a Saturday job, sorry. And then I went to university, did law, and then joined Simmons in 2007 as a trainee. And I've been there ever since. So made partner last year, as you said. My originally started off doing IT and telecoms transactions, and that's still part of what I do day to day. But about, I think it was probably 4 years ago, you and I first met, and we talked about some regulatory work that we helped you out with. And through that, really, that was the start of my career in the crypto industry. From there, it built through introductions and other pieces of work that we did, and we now work for a very significant number of crypto businesses across Europe and the world. So it's gone from 0 to 100 miles an hour very, very quickly. But it's been a really, really interesting, I don't want to use the word journey, because being a lawyer in this space is very, very complicated. It's very stressful, to be frank. There's no answers. And so you really are at the cutting edge in terms of actually setting the agenda as to where the industry is supposed to go. There's obviously big issues around the way the industry operates from, there's a broad spectrum of different businesses that operate in the sector, and we'll talk about that throughout the podcast. But generally, I think that makes it a really interesting sector to be a lawyer in, because it's not like working for your average bank or asset manager where you've got, similar issues that come up with different clients. Every client in this sector has different, fundamentally, different issues in relation to the legal work that they need help with. And that really is a very exciting place to be a lawyer.
So going to ground zero, you're just going about your day, and this word, Bitcoin or crypto, blockchain, whatever it was, what was the first word or thing that triggered your attention to this world that we're speaking about today?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I think the word really was decentralisation, because the way we operate as lawyers traditionally is that you are very grounded in the world of obviously law and regulation, limited companies, things that you can point to people, individuals that own them. Yeah, structure, absolutely. People that own them, people that operate them. You actually know who's behind these things, and you actually know how to be able to deal with them as a result. And the law is set up completely around this concept of ultimately having people behind the operations that you're advising. And so if something goes wrong, you know who ultimately is responsible. And if something's going right, you know who's going to get paid. And if you are advising a particular company, you know ultimately who's the beneficiary of your advice. Decentralization for me was really where it started to get interesting, because when you talk about having these...
but how did you have... Let's wind one step back. How did you even get to the term decentralization? What was the conversation? Was you just at the office, just about to bite into the next bite of your sandwich, and then someone starts talking to you about this crazy Bitcoin thing that's going to completely change law, how we engage, how property entitlement is going to change forever, etc. What was that moment that just thought, this is something new?
Yeah, I think for me, it was back when we saw the DAO coming out back in 2015, I think it was. And there was, at the time, I read something about it being the largest crowdfunding event in history at that point, $150 million raised, I think it was. And that was, not many people picked up on that, but I read about that and I thought, that's amazing, because $150 million has just been pledged by thousands of people to a piece of software with nobody behind it. Okay, there are, the Ethereum Foundation ultimately, but not sort of legally taking responsibility for it. Ultimately, it was this concept of, code as law and the software really being the thing that was behind the operation of a $150 million scheme. And I thought, well, that's fundamentally different from anything that I've looked at before.
And then I guess fast forward 2 weeks after that event happened.
Yeah, absolutely. And then ultimately Ethereum Classic and all that, with the concept of code maybe not being law and it all getting a little bit confusing. It started off for me looking at the DAO and thinking, this is a piece of software that's running an incredibly complicated scheme. But then suddenly when you had the fork happening after that, when everything went wrong, I thought, actually, no, there are people behind this. But curiously, in this world, and this is where the centralization bit comes in, is that these are not networks that are run by small numbers of people. They are networks that are, as we all know, run by huge numbers of disparate individuals that together create a community. And really, that's the difference for me, is the decentralization and the community aspect that really makes this so different and unusual to be a lawyer in, because it's not the kind of thing you can put your finger on and easily have any answers to. When I do talks on crypto to some of our more traditional clients, I mean, I can fill a room really easily because not many of them actually kind of understand the fundamentals.
And of course, your good looks.
And of course, yeah, I mean, that is a massive draw. But apart from that, the concept of decentralization is a very curious one for people who are really grounded in existing finance and technology. And that raises a lot of questions for people when you start talking about, forking the network and that kind of thing. People sort of say, well, you have to get all of the miners in this network to update the software, basically, in order to be able to, to carry out a fork. And that sort of creates this concept of having to bring a community together that's going to actually
make this decision.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
You touched on some really important points, which are very current right now. You mentioned code is law.
Yeah.
And then how then that plays out in the real world, and you realize maybe code isn't so much law because it doesn't really apply in the real world. What would be a good example of that? Because we have quite a few different analogies here that we use, like for instance, this whole stuff that we're definitely going to get onto with Dr. Craig Wright and proving the validity behind the claim of being Satoshi Nakamoto. You have the community, which has this very I'll say naive view and anarchist view that code is law and ownership over keys proves ownership over asset. On the surface, these things sound empowering, right? Because if you could run code and if you have access to your keys, you are empowered as an individual. It's like a warped two-step interpretation as to what real sovereignty is. Once you start going through some more doors, some further steps, you realize, okay, well, basically what I've described in the real world is me being at a bar, having a drink, getting a little bit too drunk, which is not me, I don't drink, leaving your Porsche keys on the counter, which you ain't going to utilize because you can't drive your car, right? So you go and get an Uber, but you forgot your Porsche keys on that bar counter. Guy next to you who didn't have so much to drink then thinks, that looks like a 911 key. Picks up the 911 key, goes into the car park, presses the button, waits to see which car lights up. Oh, there's a yellow line 11 over there. Must be that car. Goes in the car, drives off. Just because he had the key doesn't mean he owns that car. So what I can then do and say, okay, well, this property is registered to me through the process of a logbook and on the DVLA database, then I can give that information to the police and say, please, can you recover my vehicle? Because that's my property. In the Bitcoin world, this is lost on people. So just, I guess, from a legal standpoint, is there any claim or is there any holes in that example that I've just explained to you in terms of how a court of law process will play out if someone just says, oh, well, I've got a key to something, therefore I'm the owner? What are the processes behind a statement like that?
Yeah, sure. So you're right. There's a couple of things going on there. I think the major one is that there is a practicality point around working out who owns, take Bitcoin, for example, who owns a particular Bitcoin. And the reality is that most people consider that the blockchain and who has control over the assets as set out in the blockchain, that is the sort of primary method of working out who owns it. But obviously there are no, as you well know, there are no names against wallet addresses on the blockchain. So you determine who owns the assets in a particular wallet by reference to who is controlling that wallet. And that's the kind of easy way to look at it. Because the reality is that is the just most simple way of working out who owns it, just pure possession. Possession's 9/10 of the law, all that good stuff. But the reality is that's not the case because, just as you say, if you just take someone else's car keys and take possession of the car, it doesn't mean that you own it. And it's the same with a digital asset. The fact that you have control over the asset is in some ways kind of useful evidence to suggest that
Absolutely.
you own it, but it isn't necessarily deterministic of the fact that you actually own it. There are other things you need to look at as well. So, say if your assets are stolen from an exchange, there will be records within the exchange to tell you who owns particular assets, because all exchanges running a situation where you have a small number of wallets and then an internal ledger that sets out who owns the assets that sit within those wallets. Nobody would ever suggest that the exchange actually owns those assets, and actually in many cases the exchanges don't want to be seen to be owning those assets just purely from a tax perspective, if nothing else, and a balance sheet perspective. They want to be able to say, we are just safekeeping these assets for our clients. So the fact that the blockchain would suggest that the exchange owns those assets, the control of those assets sits with the exchanges, doesn't necessarily mean that they're your property, that the property of the exchanges. If the assets are stolen from the exchanges still have the ledgers internally to be able to say who owned particular assets that were stolen. But the difficulty comes with being able to actually recover the assets, of course, and whether you can recover them. If they were recoverable, so if we could get them back from the person who took them, then there is a process of then parceling those back out to the people who originally owned them. So it's not a question of just who actually controls the asset.
Yeah.
There are other things underpinning ownership of these assets, not just the blockchain.
Yeah.
And I think to your point, it means that we don't need to just completely live in this anarchistic world of where the code is law, because the reality is there are other legal constructs that sit on top of the blockchain that will still, at a basic level, determine things like ownership.
I think this is the thing that I've found incredibly fascinating about any new technology. I think artificial intelligence is another matter in regards to technology, which is going through the exact same challenges from a legal regulatory standpoint than this cryptocurrency movement is, because these technologies move so quickly, so quickly. And the development of these technologies, which the consequence means that society as a whole is radically different. Different. It is very easy for these different avenues of technological development to exponentially get ahead of the curve. And it's an area that I find interesting, alarming, and intriguing for a variety of different reasons. And I guess it's the Bitstocks approach to how we've always looked at this space, kind of more as the tortoise as opposed to the hare to a certain degree in certain stages, because we want to be here, period. We want to be here in 5 years, 10 years, 50 years. And just sprinting out the gate although it may seemingly seem like a great idea, and the benefits of sprinting out the gate is in the blockchain industry is there's a lot of money to be made, an incredible amount of money to be made. But the way that I've always looked at it, it's kind of like a game of Sonic the Hedgehog, running around collecting loads of coins, right? And your little count on the top left-hand side of your screen could say 99 coins. You're just about to get one more and you're on your 100 coins. And I think that's extra life, right?
I can't remember.
However, if you then make the wrong move, crash into the wall, doing, all those coins split out and they go everywhere, right? You've lost all your coins. Everything that you've accumulated through that rapid acceleration has all of a suddenly come to an instant end.
Yeah.
Right? And it's the one thing that I found really fascinating, because that's been a very tempting route to take at certain periods of time. And I say the one thing that massively solidified that I do not want to take this route, I want to be a lot more calculated about this. I want to spend some more time understanding what Bitcoin is, right? And I've spent the last 3 years of our company's 5-year history of locking myself pretty much away in a room, especially for at least the last 2 years, of getting a very deep insight into what this technology truly means and where this technology is truly actually going. And the insight that comes with that is, okay, I'm going to now build an organization around what this technology is today, but completely loaded with what I know this technology is going to be in the next 2 years, 5 years, and 10 years. What has been a very useful and helpful aid to allow me the focus to do this is the legal processes that you and I went through over these years between, I think initially we interacted over the whole ICO craze and phase. And we were potentially going to be doing an ICO ourselves. And just through, it didn't even take many conversations. It was just a few early conversations with yourself. We was both looking at this. It was a new space for me to look at from a legal perspective. And this is just a new space period for the legal profession to look at this industry.
Yeah.
So it was both basically kind of working out, okay, what is the best route and action to take, not for the immediate, because there's loads of routes and options in the immediate, but what's going to keep us standing in a couple of years from now, 5 years, 10 years from now. And very quickly, we determined ICO is not the right way to go about doing things. We reckon a lot of these are going to be essentially deemed unlicensed securities. And you can take one approach, well, it's better to ask for forgiveness than it is to ask for permission. But again, this just has Sonic the Hedgehog playing on in my head, right? It's that same short-term fast.
Yeah, and it's difficult to ask forgiveness when you've committed a criminal offence.
This is what I'm leading up to, right? Yeah. Exactly that, George. Exactly that. Because if we look at the recent activities, I don't know how much you know about what's been going on in the Bitcoin community with SV, Binance, Kraken, ShapeShift, predominantly ShapeShift, which is a byproduct of Binance shutting off their services. There was another company, UK-based company called Bitstocks, again, subsequent to Binance, because Binance is a huge liquidity pool, and you have a lot of actors connected to that liquidity pool. So you have Binance come out and essentially launch, well, I guess get behind a campaign of deeming Dr. Craig Wright as being a fraud and as being fake Toshi. Let's take this kind of segment by segment. First, let's just tackle the legal standpoint of what a definition of a fraud would be. So to call someone a fraud, from a legal standpoint, what are you insinuating?
Yeah, so I mean, I need to go back to my law school days to remember what the actual definition of what fraud actually is. But I mean, broadly, what it is it's a deliberate attempt to deceive, normally for the benefit of
financial gain. Right?
Yeah.
So you have to essentially claim you're something or do something in order to solicit some form of value, or to extract some form of value from an individual or collective individuals, corporations, etc., right? So that's one thing, is they reckon that Craig Wright, by saying that he is Satoshi Nakamoto, you can't possibly be Satoshi Nakamoto because I can't tell you why you can't be, but you don't fit into what I conjured up in my mind as to who Satoshi Nakamoto is. Therefore, you're a fraud. The other aspects is essentially that the quality of the project. In fact, let me bring up some of Binance's use case, the reasons as to why they delisted Bitcoin SV. So these are Binance's reasons as to why they'll delist Bitcoin SV. So this is off the Binance website. It's on their support.binance.com. So quickly recap it. So at Binance, we periodically review each digital asset we list to ensure that it continues to meet the high level of standard we expect. When a coin or token no longer meets this standard or the industry changes, we conduct a more in-depth review and potentially delist it. We believe this best protects all of our users. So they're then going to say, when we conduct these reviews, we consider a variety of factors. Here are some that drive whether we decide to delist a digital asset. So this is the points to pay attention to. One is commitment of team to project. Okay. Second is level of quality and development activity. Third is network or smart contract stability. Fourth is level of public communication. Fifth point is responsiveness to our periodic due diligence request. That's a very vague statement, not quite sure what that means. And then evidence of unethical or fraudulent conduct. Then lastly, contribution to a healthy and sustainable crypto ecosystem. So they're saying, based on their most recent reviews, they have decided that SV infringes on these points and they're delisting the coin. So if we just go through a couple of these one by one. So you've got the first point, commitment of team to project. And we look at SV. We look at N-Chain. We look at CoinGeek. We look at all the businesses that are supporting and also really do push the hashtag of We Choose SV. It's a very popular hashtag on Twitter. So in terms of commitment to the project, there aren't any projects really out there that are more committed to bringing something into fruition in a more structured, organized way than Bitcoin SV camp is. And you just need to look at N-Chain's patent portfolios, all the blogs that Craig Wright puts out there, all the content that CoinGeek puts out there, as people who are behind the core development team of this said project. It's very easy within 10 minutes to debunk the first statement. The second one being level and quality of development activity. So on SV, we are the only blockchain that's doing 128 megabyte blocks. Okay, we are going to be upgrading that to 2 gigabyte blocks. Bear in mind that Bitcoin said you can't go beyond 1 megabyte. Bitcoin Cash said you can't go beyond 32 megabytes. We're doing relatively consistently 128 megabyte blocks already. So scientifically proven and debunking the naysayers. Then all opcodes have been, a vast majority of opcodes have been reactivated. They're all going to be reactivated apparently by the end of the year. And just the recent op-return opcode being reactivated on Bitcoin, what that enables you to do different functions with a transaction. This has opened up the world of a Bitcoin browser called Bottle. Mm-hmm. It's enabled Bitstagram, which is a Instagram that basically runs on top of the Bitcoin SV blockchain. So your memes last forever now, right? Right. Everything on the internet, if someone captions it and whacks it on Bitstagram, that's it. It's immutable. It lasts forever. There's even MP3s being streamed from the Bitcoin SV blockchain. Mm. So we have projects that weren't even spoken about since the really early days of Bitcoin. Right, when imagination was still concentrated and an intent was still focused around one project. So there is that point. Network or smart contract stability. To be honest, any proof of work based system that has, every single one of these proof of work based systems has a decent amount of hash power behind them. So in terms of network stability, that alone isn't just unique to SV. You could say Cash as well as Bitcoin ticks those boxes massively. Level of public communication, I guess this is where you can kind of get a little bit separated, I guess, on that point, because on one side, I would say they're very communicative. On the N-Chain CoinGeek side, there's roadmaps, there's consistent conferences every single 6 months, giving you a new technical update as well as a roadmap as to what's going to happen moving forward. In terms of structuring your business around a blockchain project to build on top of, they are really clear as to what can or can't be done. There's distortion in that communication, but you have to look at that from a personal basis. And we'll get onto that as we get to the last point. And responsiveness to their periodic due diligence request. I guess that's pretty much on Binance to just define whatever they say that is or isn't. And then evidence of unethical or fraudulent conduct. So I guess this is where, again, it just goes down to opinion. Now, and the last one being contribution to a healthy and sustainable crypto ecosystem. I reckon they just basically amalgamated those last 3 points, which you can say is very subject to their own interpretation and their own opinion. But the points that are above, the 4 points above those 3 points at the bottom, which is completely subject to their own internal processes, those points above don't in any way, shape or form describe Bitcoin SV. In any way, shape or form describe Bitcoin SV. So as a investor, trader, company, whatever it is that you are, if you've been financially affected by what's happened with Binance and the subsequent exchanges, which happened very erratically over a very childish matter, basically of trolls on Twitter, manifested into people losing a lot of money. The 20% of value got wiped off the SV price because of this. There's been a lot of murmurs about people suing. I'm not super gung-ho about this whole community just getting into a big, massive suing fest, right? But to a certain degree, the whole cowboy era also needs to end, right? So it's an interesting development that's going on right now. Do you think there's credence behind any company or individual looking for financial remuneration for the actions of these exchanges because of the power and influence that they do have, even though this isn't regulated from a legal standpoint, I guess, and obviously this isn't legal advice, this is you taking a shot yourself. But how do you see this from your position? How do you see these events that have been playing out?
Yeah, sure. Isn't it? I mean, firstly, it's an incredibly interesting situation. And it's disappointing that we've got to this place by far and away. I mean, I'm not planning on taking sides, but I think for everybody, this is not a good place to be in, and for the community as a whole, not just SV, not just Bitcoin, not just Binance or whatever, the whole crypto community. This is a disastrous place to be. To have this infighting when we need to be coming together to be able to show a united front of the power of this technology, regardless of whether you're looking at SV, Cash, Bitcoin, Ether, whatever. So I think my starting point is I wish we weren't here. That would be the best place to be. In terms of sort of where we might go with this and sort of, legal action, that kind of thing, people trying to recover money lost as a result of actions, whatever. This is one of the downsides of decentralization, and is that when things aren't going great, it's difficult to know who to be able to pin it on. If you look at the way the exchanges operate generally, when you're looking at a decentralized asset like SV or like Bitcoin or any of these things, when they choose to list them, they're essentially choosing to list them off their own bat. So I know there are people in the background behind a number of these assets who are sort of pushing their case, of course, and they will be the ones that are...
Or their brown envelopes.
Who knows? But essentially, there are people pushing the case, and they will be the ones having the discussions with the Binances and other big exchanges of this world to say, please list. But a lot of these exchanges are also making the decisions off their own bat as well, actually, to list these assets, because they're good assets and they want to be able to list them, increase liquidity, make more money essentially off them. The situation around listing generally is that when you list a decentralized asset as an exchange, you don't really have a contract with somebody that says we will list this asset. Now that's different when you're talking about an ICO asset, because you have a company or a foundation that sits behind these assets, and you can actually, you have somebody you're going to talk to and do a deal with to list the asset. Decentralized, like if you're going to list classic Bitcoin, there's nobody to do a deal with to say, okay, we will list this. The exchanges list them simply because they think they're good assets that they want to have liquidity in for their users. So when they decide to delist, there's very little that we can actually do about it, simply because you don't have a contract to be able to sue the exchange to say you breached, the listing rules. Now, there are ways and means that you could try and sort of raise a claim around things like abuse of a dominant position and that kind of thing, like competition type claims perhaps. But it would be extremely expensive and very hard to be able to prove that in this market. So that's kind of the first thing, is that I think we're in a situation where we essentially there's limited recourse probably when it comes to actually kind of fixing the issue. My major issue, I think, is around how we try and fix the solution on a broader basis. And I think everyone needs to just come together and start to talk in a sensible fashion rather than going through the kind of, tit for tat that we've been having over the last few weeks, which hasn't been good for anybody.
I tell you what I find interesting from a game theory standpoint, which I guess slightly I disagree with the first part of what you're saying there, in the sense that we all need to come together. I would love that to be the case. I would love that not to be the case with Bitcoin. I would love that to be the case of human beings on this planet, period, right? But there's so many agendas at play that are very well served by dividing and conquering. Very well served by dividing and conquering. This is one thing that I feel gets such little attention in the cryptocurrency space, because if we really think about it, if we go super primitive here, why are we doing this? Why did this community band together behind the idea as to what they believe Bitcoin to be? Because the community essentially had some information from the inventor, but just like any well-constructed, dense piece of information is subject to interpretation, right? Religion's a great example of this. So it's then taken upon the community to then take those texts and then conjure up how it fits into their perspective. And I word that carefully, of how it fits into their perspective, not how they have broadened their perspective to allow them to see this for what it truly is. They've already got their own preconceived ideals as to how the world works, and they'll slot that information in and they will morph it to be more in line with what they want it to be, not what it truly is. And this space, because of this, and then you have to throw greed into the mix as well, and then cryptocurrencies affording people the ability to very easily get access to funding and all of these different ideals and technology at the detriment, at the leverage of people's laziness to not broaden their own perspective and to rely on their own critical thinking and outsource their critical thinking, to not rely on their own critical thinking and outsource their critical thinking to these Twitter messiahs, right? And this whole concept of proof of social media, that if you have 100,000 followers, then your intellect is 100,000 squared, right? For some reason, it's just how the world works.
Yeah, the more people that listen, the more validated your view is. That's
absolutely
the current position.
What I find so fascinating is the deeper you really go into understanding what Bitcoin is, put all personalities and characters to the side, okay? I really don't agree with a lot of the tactics and antics and how Craig conducts himself. But if you listen to his presentations, if you read his work, what is going on here is completely, utterly genius. Completely, utterly genius. Bitcoin isn't even complete yet. Craig's even acknowledged that Bitcoin is not even complete yet. In fact, he mentions it on the Bitstocks podcast in my interview with him. He actually speaks about it around 45 minutes of the interview that I had with him. And he actually says that he once he completes it, he hasn't even figured out what the name is going to be yet. So I've been looking and studying Bitcoin from a different perspective for a number of years now. And I'm going to start letting the world know the results of that deep dive and that perspective. Ironically, it ties into AI and a bunch of other things. Now, I know that the so-called experts in this space have not put in the work to really look into this technology at a much deeper level that transcends their greed. And they say, okay, what is this technology really? And then you can reactivate your greed. It's completely fine. But understand the technology, really understand it, and then build solutions that are going to help the world. Because when you really understand Bitcoin and you understand that this bathes the world in light, you can maintain privacy, but the way that we're going to be interacting, the way that technology is going to be interacting, the fact that this is going to be a computation unit that I can have its own dedicated IP address towards, and then I can combine this with millions of others, or billions of others, or trillions of other devices performing the exact same thing. Start thinking brain cells, neurons, and connections, right? So if you then split all of these processes around, then you've got something that is far more useful than what we're looking at Bitcoin to be today. The community doesn't understand this. They really, really don't. They're trying to go off in all of these crazy different directions, put a nice fancy banner over it, raise 10, 20, 30, 50, $100 million, and deliver absolutely diddly squat, right? Because everyone's too caught up in the illusion as to what Bitcoin is, as opposed to really doing the research and the homework to really understand what Bitcoin is. Because if people had done this, it wouldn't be a case of, all right, we just need to cast our net incredibly wide, and hopefully when we raise this net out of the ocean, we've got a bunch of fish, right? No, because everyone's net's going to be cancelling and intertwining with everyone else's net, and guess what? You've all got diddly shit, right? That is literally what's going on right now, because everyone's code ultimately emanates from Bitcoin, but they don't even understand Bitcoin, the code that they're taking, to then build their own interpretations on top of it. And then you have bucket shops essentially listing all of these other assets, not doing thorough due diligence. That is actually a decent list. If they adhered to that list properly, then we wouldn't be in the scenario and the circumstance today where all of this information has got so wildly out of control that these Cowboys or these Twitter messiahs who have got this huge following because they've taken a sonic approach to business have this now almost godlike ability to navigate, control, and orchestrate the market. This is only possible due to the fact that human beings, at their core, unless they're seriously interested in something, are fundamentally lazy and outsource their thinking to somebody else because it's too hard for them to do it themselves, right? This is how mainstream media works, this is how news gets propagated, all of these crazy things. It's just based on this very, very simple principle of not doing your own homework. Now, on the one hand, you could say ignorance is bliss. But in the case of when we're talking about money, and providing a new solution to money, providing equal access to a neutral economic system that can be truly global, truly transcend the power of one individual government. In fact, empower governments to actually build trust in new ways with the people they claim to actually govern, all right? Many people don't want that, George. Many people don't want that. And this is the one thing I thought gets so lost on the cryptocurrency community. And this is where the whole anarchist, hippie, tree hugging, I want the whole world to be all nice and rosy, this group, this collective of individuals that people try to put me in that box. And my feelings are in that box, but my business brain's all the way over here. Is that because we want it, we will be delivered it. And it's just going to come in the most positive way and assume that everything is positive and it's somehow all going to freaking work out.
Yeah.
Right? No. And this is where I really agree with what Craig is doing. I'm going to get into some of his tactics in a bit, but I really agree with what he's doing because it's proof of work. I'm not talking about Bitcoin network. I'm talking about what the guy's doing. Putting all the patents out there, building the technology. He's actually putting work out there. And then you got to think about that from a legal and strategic standpoint. So if I'm Satoshi Nakamoto, okay, Dr. Craig Wright in this instance, and people over a series of years are saying to me, I'm fake Toshi, I'm defrauding people somehow, although no one could put money forward and say, this is how much money it is I've taken from them. You're bastardizing my invention. You don't understand, you're all basically getting it wrong. And now on top of that, you're gonna pour salt over that wound and insult me on a consistent basis. A lot of that he does not help himself, like at all. Like a lot he does not help himself. However, this is really what's happening. So I didn't want to be dragged out as Satoshi a few years ago. Okay, but those are the cards that got dealt, and I've just had to best manage the situation from here onwards. I would want to manage the situation in a way that allows me to have ownership over the narrative. Okay, that allows me to get at least some control over when certain information gets released. Because I said Bitcoin's not finished. So if you just start throwing all of this information out there to prove who you are, the real plan as to what Bitcoin is, where the real value is, and everyone thinks it is what it is right now, hasn't been finished. So you don't want a lot of information as to what Bitcoin is. What other people perceive Bitcoin to be because they fit it into their little box is irrelevant. And even if it grew to being this market that just almost nudged $1 trillion, it's nothing, George. What Bitcoin is becoming is where the real value is. So he's going to want to put information out there when he feels it's right to put information out there that assess and manage ultimately his agenda, their agenda, and what it is that they're doing. So he's got this court case going on with the Kleinman Estate. So that's been going on now for a while. Now there's like legal papers being put out there where you can actually sit, you can actually read through the court process and what was actually said and discussed in court. He then had a deposition on the 4th, and this was basically a week before all of this craziness started kickstarting. Yeah. So you got the heating up of the Kleinman case, you got the deposition, and Craig and his side seem to be providing a lot of information so to allow the other side to basically come to the determinations that they want to come to. He's also been writing blog posts about the fact that the Australian tax records show that the domain bitcoin.org was purchased on Craig Wright's credit card, and that's on his tax filings, right? And this is in 2008 that he purchased that domain, and it's on his tax filings. And then you have to factor in that he's got 16 patents approved, he's got in excess of 600 in the process, and he wants it to be at 1,000 by the end of the year. And then he's making statements and claims that he wants to have the largest amount of patents of any human being that has ever existed. I think he wants it to go way past 10,000 patents. Now, you then have this Holdernaut scenario, right? This spaceship cat, right? That's launching this new campaign. You could say this. I'm not going to make Craig painted out to be a victim here. Like, he's antagonized a lot, right? To be honest, he's been a right arsehole in many different regards as to how he's handled. But he embraces that, and he even says it himself. He doesn't mind being a bad guy. He likes to play the bad guy, and it works for him right now. But then what I think is like really smart what he's doing is going back to the whole Porsche analogy. Having keys, assigning a transaction with keys to say, I am Satoshi Nakamoto, doesn't make sense, right? It doesn't prove I own that asset and that I am really the inventor, because then people are just going to say, I stole the keys, right? And that's definitely what this troll army would have loaded up instantly and said after they called him out and said, you have to sign, okay?
Yeah, it's a bit like when you try and argue against a flat earther and you show them a picture of, from space, and they just say, well, NASA just made that up.
Don't bring up flat earth. It's such a painful subject matter. There are some true believers out there, but you're absolutely right. what I think is really smart and genius from, I guess, Craig's side from a game theory standpoint is let those come at you, and then he's suing these people for defamation, right? What is the interest for a billionaire whose business partner is a billionaire, who has this patent portfolio, genuinely is the smartest guy in the space, he invented Bitcoin, just follow his work, study his work, Calvin, multi-billionaire in his own right and successful in his own right. Do you really think these guys are interested for the financial gain of suing some random person on Twitter who himself has said that he has no money and he doesn't care about the money, so he's all gung-ho for this lawsuit? Well, it's not financial gain is what they're interested in. Well, maybe they baited the trolls. So if we bring up, say, for instance, the Peter McCormack case, which is pretty hilarious. So he wrote apparently this is a legal letter he got.
It's a response to a letter from Craig Wright's lawyers asking him to cease and desist and do various things in relation to the claims that he's been making in relation to Craig.
So this will just bring up on the screen, but you'll see the immaturity of the response. But what's interesting in the response is that what he's basically saying, that for him to step down on his claims that Craig is Satoshi, he's asked for a couple of points. That Craig provides evidence which he is Satoshi, not the same nonsense that he has published time and time again. If not, then see points 2 to 6 above. And that is basically ha ha ha. You'll see that on the screen. But I just need to focus on that one point. That is all what I would want to be a term and a condition if somebody is then essentially counter-suing me for my defamation lawsuit. Because now I'll just be like, okay, cool. This isn't some big, long-winded legal battle with the whole Kleinman estate. I'd imagine that's going to be a much more long-winded legal process, because there's real agendas from both sides and they're going at it from both sides. But with this is just some random guy on Twitter who clearly isn't the brightest spark, who has now fallen into the bait of saying, okay, I will basically step down on my claims and I assume issue an apology on the basis that you can legally prove that you are Satoshi Nakamoto. So if Craig goes into court and provides evidence and the judge whacks down on that evidence and says, yes, this is a determination, this guy's clearly proved beyond any form of reasonable doubt, and we've checked it all out that this guy is the inventor called Satoshi Nakamoto, is Dr. Craig Wright. That means that this whole side, people like Peter McCormack, who are involved in this suit, your Binance CEO, your Kraken CEO, people like Roger Ver, these huge messiahs in the crypto space, almost instantly lose all credibility. Because not only do you now have to basically apologize, right, and get your foot out of your mouth, you can never be deemed an expert on Bitcoin ever again, because you did not even identify not the personality of the creator. That's here or there. That's irrelevant. But the work of what the creator is actually baked into Bitcoin. You don't even understand Bitcoin itself. This whole space, this is like the kill shot. It's a very uneased place and almost uncomfortable place if you don't have this perspective, if you don't see the different moving components that's going on. But from my perspective, this has now just opened up a whole world of new business opportunity, a whole world of new opportunity within the Bitcoin space, because this market is about to have a reset. And there is going to be a huge cleansing process of this whole wild, wild west cowboy mentality that has been fueled by essentially ignorance and idealism to a rude, very rude awakening from a legal standpoint. So the question I have after that very long foundation is, how long would you anticipate or expect a kind of childish court case like that to go on for? I mean, how much time would a judge have really? I guess it's unique because of the name Bitcoin, Satoshi Nakamoto, and Craig Wright. But if we take Satoshi and Craig Wright out the scenario and out the equation, and I'm suing you because you're being really horrible to me online. Right?
You found those posts, did you?
Yeah, I found them. Apparently, I'm not a better driver than you, George, but we'll talk about that in a minute. And I have an issue with that, and I just have to prove that I am who I am. How much time really would a court of law have for that?
Yeah,
really?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, it's going to take a while. And I'm talking purely from an English law perspective. I have no idea. I can't remember which jurisdiction Craig is trying to bring a claim in. But essentially what Craig's done is he's put together his letter before action, which is where you send someone a letter saying, I'm planning on suing you because you're doing X, Y, and Z, and asking basically for what you want them to do in order to avoid going to court. And then obviously we've got the response from Pete McCormack. And then now the ball's back in Craig's court to decide whether he actually wants to bring that claim or not. Mm-hmm. So there'll be a decision made on his side as to whether he actually wants to go to court. And so the next thing will either be nothing happens, or Pete McCormack gets essentially court papers served on him to say we're off to the races. So that that's completely in the hands of Craig as to how long it takes. From that point, you're talking multiple months, probably between a year and 18 months, I'd guess, before you'd have an initial judgment, because there'll be a process of disclosure where you send each other documents, and there would be expert witnesses, and there would be all sorts of different witness statements created, and then there would be a case heard in court, and there would be a period of time before the judge actually hands down his decision. I'm not a defamation lawyer, so I can't remember whether these are done by jury or not, but there may be a jury trial. I forget.
This is what I find interesting, because I, on the surface, completely agree. Absolutely agree. But what makes this interesting is this climate thing's been going on a while. So you would imagine Craig's been getting all of his ducks in a row for a while.
Probably, yeah. And so obviously the defendant in this case, Pete McCormack, is at a bit of a disadvantage because he probably wasn't expecting this to happen. It's pretty unprecedented in the world of crypto that somebody would sue another person, just because there seems to be a fairly well-established way of working that people sort of take their punches on Twitter and kind of just roll with them, and that's just the way the industry works. This is a new development, and obviously I think Pete probably wasn't expecting this. His response to the letter before action was probably not the cleverest. I mean, again, I'm not taking sides, but I think I have no idea if Craig is Satoshi or not. But if I got a letter through the door saying that someone was suing me because of stuff I'd said on Twitter, I'd take it quite seriously, regardless of whether or not thought the claims were actually had any base to them. I would probably send back a more sensible letter than the one that he did. Because
would you sign it the same way?
that was funny. That was very funny. But the whole process that he's now that is a court document that's going to be looked at in evidence if it goes to court, and it's going to play against him. Unfortunately, there will also be a significant amount of evidence that's brought before the court in relation to the baiting on both sides and that sort of thing. It feels to me like it'd be quite a difficult case to actually prove either way, because say Craig can't prove it that he's Satoshi, or can't prove it to the satisfaction of the court, then there's a question as to whether there's defamation or not. Just because he can't prove it, does that mean it's true that he's a fraud? It's a very difficult thing to prove. So you're in a difficult position as a Pete McCormack, because you're saying this person's a fraud, even if he can't prove it. You still said something that's quite incendiary. But the fact there's been this huge back and forth and this escalation over a period of, I don't know how long it was, that there was this Twitter slanging match going on, that's not going to play in the hands of either party trying to win the case. Yeah. I'd imagine there's probably not going to be a winner coming out of it. Ultimately, everyone will lose in some way or another. But it'll be very interesting.
That's what I think is interesting is the timing, because I agree with everything that you just said there. But it's the timing which I find really interesting in relation to, say, what's going on with the Kleinman case, the fact that Craig being removed from Twitter itself as well, but the fact that he is building a solution to all of these things. MetaNet is the solution to all of these things, right? So to then go after somebody, I would make sure that I would have, considering all this other, he's got his technical ducks in a row with the moves that he's making. So getting your legal ducks in a row, I would imagine it's probably been the game plan, just sitting there on his desk and waiting for execution. So I definitely think it's just going to be interesting couple of months. It really is a pole shifting moment within the community, within the space, because if this is determined that Craig is Satoshi, people are going to focus their attention towards the work that has been going on. And that really is going to begin and start changing, I guess, everything, absolutely everything with this space. So let's move on to a different subject matter. Bitstocks, so we're going through our corporate structuring right now, and we've chosen the UK to be our HQ and do our corporate structuring here. Yep. And that's been a long process that we've gone through to determine as to why it is that we've chosen the UK. But so what subject areas for you are interesting in relation to Bitcoin and cryptocurrency space from a regulatory standpoint, where the UK sits and stands right now? We've got Brexit going on. So what are the exciting and I guess challenging aspects of you being a partner at one of the biggest financial law firms in the UK? Mm-hmm. How's the landscape?
Yeah, it's an interesting time. I mean, well, I say it's an interesting time. It has been an interesting time in crypto and with regulation for the last 3 years. The bizarre thing I always think in this sector is that when I or one of my colleagues does a talk to some of our clients about X, Y, and Z topics, we get a good turnout. But when I do a talk on crypto regulation, you get so many people because there is this incredible link between the fate of the crypto industry and where the regulators are going, and those two things are completely intertwined. And so everybody always really wants to have their finger on the pulse in relation to where regulators are going next. Now, and the UK actually is a pretty good place actually to understand where regulation is currently headed. And that's one of the reasons why you and I both sat down and agreed the UK was a sensible place to stay. Because, and there's a good number of reasons for that, but just taking the regulatory piece first. In the UK, the regulators, the FCA, has been pretty sensible about how it's regulated crypto. Back in 2017, when we had the explosion on the price and ICOs and things like that, a lot of regulators around the world were taking some pretty drastic steps. Understandably so, places like China shutting it down simply because they had such a massive red-hot crypto industry. They had to kind of take steps to cool it down. And you had the US as well with a lot of the regulatory pronouncements that happened there in 2017 and continuing today to try and cool the industry down. The UK took a much more measured approach. I think we had the benefit of the industry not being quite as large as it was in China or the US. Things weren't quite as red hot, which was beneficial. I mean, the regulators could kind of watch a bit more without being afraid that everything was going to explode.
Yeah.
But that watching brief that they've had meant that actually we're in a really good position now from the perspective of the industry. So we're going through a couple consultations at the moment with the FCA. They launched one earlier this year around what they regulate in terms of crypto, and a consultation that closed at the beginning of this month. A new one just came out last week or the week before, I forget, around money laundering requirements and the fifth money laundering directive.
Yeah, that's in effect from January next year, right?
That's the plan, yeah, although the government has said that they're planning on potentially bringing that in earlier as a priority because they want to make sure that crypto businesses are doing proper KYC. Mm-hmm. Interestingly, I think it probably won't have much of an effect on the existing industry in the UK, since pretty much everybody we've ever come across does full KYC as if they were compliant, as if they needed to conform with the law. So that's probably not going to change much, but they are planning on gold plating the fifth money laundering directive, so going beyond what the European Union requires and actually applying KYC requirements to a number of other portions of the industry as well, ATM providers and crypto ATM providers, that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. But again, I think most of the industry is already compliant, so it's not going to change much. The next big consultation will be around not just what the FCA regulates now, which we had earlier this year, but whether they need to change that to expand their scope to be able to regulate other aspects of crypto which aren't regulated at the moment. That's going to be the interesting one, because that's going to really show the FCA's hand. Clearly, the FCA have a lot of other things that they're dealing with at the moment. You mentioned Brexit. That's taking up a huge amount of governmental time. And so my personal feeling from, I just can't imagine that crypto is right at the top of the list at the moment.
Yeah.
Clearly they have a remit to work on it, and they will be working on it, but I suspect that they've got bigger fish to fry at this point. So my guess is that the consultation won't be coming out for a few months yet. But that'll be an interesting one to see where the direction of the industry is going, where the direction of regulation is going.
So where do you think that second part will start affecting actions at companies, for instance? So with all of this malarkey that's going on with the Bitcoin community, we at Bitstocks have taken it upon ourselves to make some strategic decisions. So when we're going to launch Gravity, that has actually been brought forward. I'm not going to announce it here, but that's being brought forward. So we're going to do it in sections to help aid the Bitcoin SV support and the Bitcoin SV community. And also we've brought forward one of our models, which is the Gravity Exchange, which I'm definitely not going to say too much on right now. But we've been preparing for this inevitable moment that's going to come now, pretty much for the last few years anyway. It's always been our perspective to run the business a certain way. So not listing or dealing with these other assets that have a high probability of being deemed unlicensed securities. It's just an approach that we're going to take from the ground zero to just not work with those assets. There's huge technical advantages to not working with all of these assets as well. It just completely burdens and loads you down because these blockchains aren't properly supported anyway, and it's just a technical nightmare. So we only are going to work on proof of work based blockchains, and obviously with a very aggressive Bitcoin SV bias. When do you expect, I guess, if we was running an exchange already right now, was listing all of these different assets, even Monero and Zcash are part of the assets that we offer, okay? And we offer crypto to crypto, but also crypto to fiat pairs in these respective assets as well. When are these exchanges or companies who are dealing in these other assets based on the conversations that are happening with the FCA right now, because that second component is interlinked with this, right?
Yeah.
When do you expect these conversations to start transpiring to actions in the actual market itself?
Yeah, so the first step will be the consultation, and that'll really show the FCA's hand as to what they think.
That's in a few months, you said?
That would be my guess. It is due to come out quite soon, next couple of months, you would imagine. They have to finish the consultation process for the existing consultation around where the perimeter of the FCA's remit sits now, before they can start talking about where to move the perimeter from to, if you see what I mean. You've got to know where you are to be able to say where you're going.
Yeah.
So that's the first step. So next couple of months, I'd imagine the next consultation will come out. That will say what the FCA is thinking, and it will ask for views from anybody who wants to give their views as to what they think of the FCA's thoughts. Now, the FCA have got 3 distinct categories of tokens that they put everything into. So they've got exchange tokens, which are your classic decentralized assets. Bitcoin SV would fall within that. Ethereum, Litecoin, those kind of classic cryptos. Decentralized, they don't have a central issuer. They would call them exchange tokens. Then you've got security tokens, which are classically kind of security ICO tokens, which have the hallmarks of a regulated product in the UK. And then you have utility tokens, which are ICO tokens, which are not really considered to be securities because they don't have the hallmarks of a regulated product.
Casino chips. Walking in a casino, you can only use those chips within the confines of the casino.
Exactly. It's similar to like a voucher code almost that just happens to be on a blockchain. That would be a utility token. Doesn't look like anything that's regulated today. It would be a utility token unregulated. There's some nuances around that, like where tokens that are e-money, where they sit, that kind of thing. But that, in very broad terms, that's where it sits at the moment. Now, the way regulation works at the moment is that if you're an exchange, you can deal in exchange tokens and utility tokens, assuming they're not e-money. Let's just ignore that point. That's kind of the basic situation. This isn't legal advice, but this is kind of a high level overview as to where we sit. And then
I'll put a little disclaimer at the bottom. Don't worry.
Absolutely, please. Yeah, I need to review the wording of that as well. And then you've got security tokens, which are very heavily regulated in the UK and across Europe, and everybody has their own definitions of what these types of assets are. But broadly, if you're dealing in regulated product, there are very stringent requirements around how you can provide services in respect to them. And actually, there are lots of different types of services that, if you touch security tokens, are regulated. Not just providing an exchange service, which is an extremely heavily regulated activity, but also things like helping someone to do a deal from sending a security token from one person to another.
Yeah. That
could potentially be regulated as well, all sorts of things like that. So you need to be, as you've said, super careful about whether you're touching security tokens or not. And really, that's where all the exchanges have an extreme level of worry. And so a lot of them, the more legitimate ones, do a lot of research on that before they list any tokens that might potentially be securities, because the penalties for getting that wrong are pretty significant. Yeah. But in terms of where we might go, the first thing is whether or not the FCA wants to start regulating exchange tokens, which in my view would be quite complicated because these aren't traditional assets. They're decentralized. They're very different from your classic shares, bonds, debt, derivatives that have a central issuer, that have companies backing them. Decentralized assets, much more difficult to work out who controls them. If you said, if a regulator said, okay, Bitcoin SV is now regulated and it must have the following characteristics. The rules are, in order to be allowed to be sold in the UK, it must have the following characteristics, which is kind of how it works in relation to like a derivative. But there's nobody out there that actually would, maybe Craig and Calvin would get together and try and work together a change to be able to make Bitcoin SV compliant. But the reality is that there's no one person that you can hit to say, okay, you need to change this asset to be able to make it compliant. It's very difficult to regulate the assets themselves. But what the regulators might do is regulate entities that are dealing in those assets, primarily the exchanges, by doing things like what ESMA, and don't ask me what ESMA stands for off the top of my head, I can't remember, but they're a European Securities and Markets Association, I think. They are a European level regulator that regulates securities across Europe. Now, what ESMA said a few months ago is that they're not planning on imposing heavy regulation on exchanges. Instead, what they want to do is impose money laundering, KYC checks in line with the 5th Money Laundering Directive, which is fine. It's pretty straightforward. And the other thing was in relation to potentially increasing transparency to the exchange's users around things like pricing and risks of investing in the assets and that kind of thing, to make sure there are minimum standards around transparency of risks of people getting into this market, which is pretty sensible. The regulators in the UK last year had taken a slightly different tack. They've said that they want to regulate exchanges somehow, and that's led to this slight dichotomy between the FCA, what they said last year around wanting to regulate exchanges, and what ESMA said earlier this year around potentially just doing quite light touch regulation. So I really don't know where we'll go in terms of whether we'll go down the ESMA route to try and stay in step with Europe, or whether we'll do our own thing and go a little bit more kind of heavy-handed. But we just need to wait and see on that front.
What I find always interesting when I speak with you is when you bring up the subject matter, I guess, of you've got this unique vantage point, right? You're the center point, you've got your ICO-esque individuals, say, on one side trying to get you guys to do some great work for their BS project, which I know you guys tend to very politely bugger off. Then you've got companies who are trying to do things the right way, but somehow predict what the whites and the blacks are going to be from this big grey muck that we have, which is, I guess, Bitstocks, and try and do it in a way that leaves a path for others to form a standard. And there are other companies who are part of that in the UK as well. And then you've got, I guess, institutional players on the other side, right? The traditional businesses who are interested in this technology, but then hear certain things and get terrified, get interested again, then look into it, get terrified, interested again, look and get terrified.
Yeah.
I think that aspect is something that doesn't get discussed enough, right? And it's a really, really interesting one because you're literally the center point, right? You get it from all angles. So from what you just said about regulation, how are the traditional financial companies looking at this? And what do you feel they're waiting for? And what's the appetite with traditional finance institutions?
Yeah, it is a privileged position that we're in, being able to see how lots of different people are approaching the issue. In terms of what kind of traditional industry is waiting for, there's a couple of things. Some of them are further along the road than others, and actually the ones that are not that far along the road, they tend to be waiting for regulators to do something. They're not so keen on the sector that they're actually gone to the trouble of really educating themselves to the point where they would take a bit more of a risk because they really believe in it. They haven't got to the point of really kind of having looked into it enough to take that leap. So what they're doing is they don't want to be the first movers and therefore be the first ones to get hit by a regulator for doing something naughty. So they tend to be kind of standing back. They're waiting to see how everything's going to go. And if the regulator gives a green light by, regulating exchanges in a light touch fashion or something, that's going to be a huge boost to the industry, and it creates an element of legitimacy from a regulator that we don't have at the moment that would bring in industry. There are some parts of industry that are a lot more educated. They're watching it a lot more closely. And actually, my impression of it is they're not waiting for the regulator to jump and do something. They're keen to get involved. As long as the regulator doesn't ban it, they're quite happy to get involved, with the current greys and limited whites and blacks that we have at the moment. The one thing they are waiting for, though, is for the industry itself, the crypto industry, to settle down a bit. And I think this is where I go back to the point I made earlier around the industry coming together. So from my perspective, what I see is all the different clients that I talk to, everyone has a different mindset around where they want this industry to go, the crypto industry. But when you look at the traditional industries like finance and banks and asset managers, really what they would wish for is stability, proper stability. So with less of the infighting that we have at the moment, less of the large figureheads that kind of control different assets and control major exchanges and that kind of thing, to limit the amount of power that individuals have. I mean, just going down to the very basics of it, one problem we have consistently in this sector, in the crypto industry, is market manipulation. And that is one of the major things that we need to stamp out quickly, because you will not get large banks and asset managers and other major players coming in.
But from what aspect of market manipulation are you coming from? Are you coming from the aspect of privileged information and trading of that privileged information, or are you talking about privilege in terms of your position in the supply chain, so rent-seeking behavior? Mm-hmm. So if you're on exchange, China's exchanges, for instance, which has laid good foundation as to why I guess the government cracked down on them so aggressively, although that's not a black and white scenario, is they were all zero fees. Completely zero, but they were making a fortune. So how can you have a zero-fee exchange model and make a fortune? Well, maybe you want to sell Bitcoin for $1,000, and I've got someone else who will buy Bitcoin for $1,010, and this is going to happen in a fraction of a second. Then, well, okay, I'll buy from you, and I'll sell to the other guy, and I've just made $10. You do this enough on a high-frequency basis because you have the vantage point. Issue is, the majority of the exchanges aren't sophisticated enough for other people to run good high-frequency exchange, high-frequency trading models, right? It's actually something that we're looking into right now with Bitstocks, with the intelligence engine that I'm building with Bitstocks, and I'm seeing the limitations, just how technologically undeveloped this space is in comparison to real markets. So the only way that you could, I guess, run some form of equivalent to a high-frequency model in a completely corrupt way is basically the Chinese exchange model. You zero your fees, you get loads of volumes on your exchange, and you take advantage of basically rent-seeking between your own book. So if I'm a institution, or if someone's coming to me, I'm the SEC, and you're pitching me for an ETF, right?
Yeah.
I'm going to present this. I'm going to raise this question, right? It's like, how can you give me confidence, proof that this activity is not happening?
Yeah, exactly. That's a fundamental part of it. The last thing that the SEC or the FCA is going to do is approve a product like an ETF or whatever it is that's backed by an asset like Bitcoin, where we have consistent levels of market manipulation, both in terms of large players that are distorting the market through, whether it be reduced fees in order to be able to maximize their market share, whether that's kind of abuse or not, I'm not sure. But the major one for me is the pumping and dumping. It's some of the less legitimate exchanges having privileged information, allowing themselves to trade off it in the background. It's the huge amounts of wash trading that we get on some of the exchanges. All these things that mean that price discovery just is very difficult, even in the most liquid crypto asset. All of these things we need to stamp out before you're going to see major institutional focus in this area, because all of these things just reduce their ability to be able to get their boards comfortable with playing in the sector.
Completely agree. And this goes back to, I guess, the first points that we were discussing, which is the ignorance, I guess, of the space and people fitting what they want this space to be into their already limited perspective and not realizing how much they're hurting themselves on the other side by not broadening that perspective. And that's, damn right, medium and long term. This is going to hurt us, and we're not making real progress. I would argue we've had 10 years of basically doing diddly squat. It hasn't been productive, and that's where the unity aspect, I completely agree, but that unity aspect needs to be on a project, like one project. Obviously, I'm going to say it's Bitcoin by Bitcoin. I made Bitcoin SV, not because of any personality, not because of Satoshi Nakamoto. To be honest with you, quite frank, I don't really care about these things. The only thing I care about is real technology. And can you back it up? Does it actually check out when I look into it? And then if I showed what I've found to somebody else who's competent and they look into it, they come to the same results that I came to, right? Or they scrutinize it and then collectively he either brings me on board with his thinking because it's even greater than mine, then I'll be hugging that individual for that.
I'm with you on that. I think that one of the biggest disasters we've had in the crypto industry is the 2,000 plus coins that we've got at the moment. That the market is just so fractured, when really, ultimately, everyone just needs to get behind the project and really,
And the irony is, we got into this Bitcoin thing because what it gave the world is digital immutability. So what human beings then done is they found the one aspect of how you can copy this system by putting a different name on it. And then we just create loads of copies, right? So we took something that's digitally immutable, the one thing that gives it value, the thing that we all love this technology for, and when we truly understand how far that immutability...
Digitally unique assets. And then we copy them.
And then we copy them.
And that's why we had just very basic terms, that's why we had the crash in the price when we had the fork between ABC and SV, because everyone suddenly started saying, well, they're not that unique if you can just make new ones.
Yeah, and that's the issue, because on the surface, absolutely, that argument stacks and it stands. But then you look underneath the surface and you look at the engineering of these projects and you look at the harmonics, and I use that word deliberately, of how these numbers communicate with one another. The fact that this has been taken into consideration. Whoever designed this system is thinking on the quantum level. Like point blank, they're thinking on a quantum level. When you unveil what Bitcoin really is, it will blow your freaking mind. Absolutely blow people's mind. And this, I believe, isn't unique to just the SV camp and a few guys behind the SV camp and people like myself who sat down and just converted a whole section of their house to working this stuff out. I think there's actually people out there who do know this, who don't like what this means. The fact that this bathes the world in light. And it then gives a bank two choices. I can be a bank of immutability, transparency, and solvency. Or I could be a bank that makes all of its money running in the shadows because I'm not affording and not offering this. I can be a government. Transparency, immutability, and sovereignty. Or I can be a government who utilizes the shadows to get away and do what it is that I want to do. This is why I keep going on, and I will continue to keep on banging on about this point, that we need to move away from blanket terms of calling governments, banks, companies, a collective of individuals, whatever banner you want to put on it, if you want to put a religious identifier, if you want to put a scientific identifier, no matter what identifier you want, any collective, and then whacking one big tarnish banner over that collective, we need to move away from this thinking. Because you and I are perfect examples of debunking this thinking. It's like we are very much involved in the two core structures, I guess, of what the anarchists will frown their nose up at, which is banking, finance, and law, right? But both of us are by no means conformist. We're by no means anarchists, but what we understand, if we do want any form of positive change for ourselves, for our children, for our co-collective state on this planet, we have set structures, and instead of bitching and moaning, let's bang out the work, right? And if you want to put reform in place, then put in the work to put reform in place.
That's right.
But it has to come from the inside.
Absolutely, yeah.
Right?
You can't expect all of this, 1,000 years of the legal and financial system to just be changed overnight.
Because some guy that you don't even know, and that will argue against anyone who tells you it's this person, told you that you believe it code is law, right? And you completely misunderstood the message. Absolutely misunderstood the message. So I think that's a pretty good point to start, I guess, wrapping up on now. So before I let you run away, George, and I assume we're probably going to be jumping on the phone again at some point today about all things Bitstocks and all things Gravity. Any last remaining points you would like to raise or end up on?
I think it's a very interesting time at the moment for the sector. There's a lot to do, though. I think one of the things that we all forget, or most people forget, is that we're still, we're 10 years in, but you think about how long it took to create, the banking industry, the credit card industry. We're right at the start. And I think everyone's expecting at the moment that this sector needs to be complete and finished and working perfectly. We've still got a really long way to go. I'm hoping that we can get past, where we are at the moment, stop calling each other names, and start, working together, as you say, to be able to build, something that's going to work and something that's going to change the world. That would be my dream.
Completely agree. And the only thing I'll add on that is, as always, I always say in every single episode, every podcast, everything that I'm involved in, nothing said here is to be taken at face value or to be taken as gospel. That it be taken as area matters to spark your own thought process and go off and doing your own research. This space is just as George said, we're at the infancy, we're at the really elementary stages. But this next stage, which I will add on to what we're embarking on and where it is that we're going, is going to be truly revealing. People are going to really uncover and realize the power that is baked in the original version of Bitcoin. Money is a prerequisite that enables the real utilities of what Bitcoin is and where it's going to be built. And that message goes to everyone. It doesn't matter if you're a Bitcoin supporter, Bitcoin Cash supporter, Ethereum supporter, EOS supporter, I don't care what it is. It's not about clicks and banners. It's about technology. Go back to square one. You owe it to yourself to just look at this from a new perspective with fresh eyes, with the view to go deeper and to truly understand, to alienate and eliminate any form of personality, individual, and just owe it to yourself to go on a technical journey to understand the true power hidden within Bitcoin itself. And Bitstocks and myself, definitely, most certainly, and personally, will be aiding you guys on that journey and putting out some revealing content over the course of the next month to really help hammer home the point of the power that's baked inside Bitcoin, and to really cut through this mess and this infighting that we are seeing with just intellect, truth, light, and knowledge. So with that, peace, love, and light. I apologize for my grisly look. My barber's very selfishly taking his wife to Barbados, and I'm loyal. So next time, I promise, I'll be looking a lot more normal and a lot sharper than I am right now. So peace, love, and light. All the best. Thank you.